What you are looking at right now is the single most disruptive piece of military technology in the world at the moment. Or it's a bunch of t-shirts. There is no way to know from this video, and that's sort of the point. At the beginning of June, Ukraine unleashed Operation Spiderweb, smuggling drones across Russia inside of shipping containers, and then unleashing them to cause untold rubles in damage to the Russian Air Force. Simultaneously, unbeknownst to the rest of the world, Israel had been developing a similar plan against Iran, with the target this time being Iranian air defenses. This quickly allowed Israel to own the Iranian skies, which paved the way for a US intervention about a week later, this time shifting the target to a few key Iranian nuclear sites. Indeed, the whole thing about nuclear weapons drove attention away from Israel's drone strategy. Nonetheless, as far as we can tell, it was a critical component of the plan. Here's the thing, though. This is just the beginning. Smuggled drones are a global problem now, with the potential danger in the billions for all parties involved. And I do not mean that in the sense that the United States is like Russia, and also leaves its expensive planes out in the open, and so maybe it is time to invest in some hangars that would protect them from such simple attacks. I am talking about how even trying to deduce who was responsible for such an attack leads to much, much deeper strategic problems. And the issue seems all the more salient now that Iran may seek retribution for the US strikes on its soil. Never mind what might happen if a traditional conflict breaks out between the parties. So, let's get to it. I want to begin by discussing the military vulnerability of Russia and Iran, because there is a misconception about the implication here. Obviously, I am not the first person to realize that Ukraine's attack could be replicated elsewhere. Israel's strikes on Iran laid that bare. But the conventional wisdom about the exact nature of the problem tends to go down the wrong path. That basic argument is that Ukraine and Russia are currently at war. And, at the risk of saying something truly shocking, Russia is well aware of this. Thus, border security in Russia is extra tight. Internal security is extra tight. Russia's intelligence agencies are working overtime. Air defenses are at the ready. You get the idea. Despite those obstacles, Ukraine still managed to cripple a sizable chunk of Russia's bomber fleet. And while Israel and Iran were not technically at war when the Trojan horse drones came out there, they have been in a constant state of low-level gray zone conflict for a long time, if not more than that, including through the use of proxy forces. And Israel and Hamas were definitely at war before Iran became an active participant. So the logic goes, if hardened targets like Russia and Iran are vulnerable, just think about how easy it would be to strike the United States or Europe. Well, one thing I want you to take away from this video is that, from a military perspective, Russia and Iran are indeed hard countries to target. But again, that is just about internal preparations, and those are only half the story. What we need to add to the mix is the risk of retaliation. A lot was made about how Russia responded to Operation Spiderweb, with air quotes very much around responded. Perhaps you saw some sort of headline that noted that Russia was firing a record number of drones at Ukraine as alleged punishment for the operation. If that were true, then yeah, Kyiv might want to rethink the wisdom of conducting attacks deep on Russian soil. And while there have been records, the causal chain here is all wrong. The records are not a response at all. Actually, to prove my point, I was playing a bit of a trick on you there. This headline about a record number of drone attacks, that was from the end of May, meaning that it came before Ukraine strikes. The pace was picking up well before part of Russia's bomber fleet disintegrated. Heck, we could go back to the end of last year. Guess what? The discussion was about records being set then too. And it will not surprise you that the records are still being set now, post-Operation Spiderweb. But Critically, not caused by Operation Spiderweb. It is just a number that goes up over time. However, it is easy to miss the trend unless you are constantly staying current on the story. That is why I like to use the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, and tailor my feed to focus on the topics that I am most interested in, like Ukraine, Russia, Iran, and Israel. They say it is a curse to live in interesting times, but hey, Ground News is going to help me power through it. And you too can tailor your own feed, plus get a ton of useful meta information about the news that you are consuming. All it takes is a Vantage subscription. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can get 40% off of this service. So thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support of this channel. What we really need to be talking about here is a political deterrence perspective. In that light, Russia and Iran were among the easiest targets out there. Using political violence is a strategic decision that policymakers choose because they think there will be some type of benefit attached to political violence, while the downside risk of political violence is comparatively small. Put yourself in Zelensky's shoes for a moment. What exactly was the downside risk here to Ukraine? Well, the answer is not much. Just as we discussed right after the attack, Russia was already at war with Ukraine, and it was not like Moscow was pulling punches. Russia ramped up its drone strikes in the following days, yes, but that was it. Again, the number is just ticking up over time, regardless of what Ukraine does. But here is the thing. Russia has been scaling its drone production over the last year or so. The assembly lines are producing about 5,200 per month, but that number is likely outdated by the time that you are watching this. Thus, the reason that Russia could deploy all of those drones at the same time is simply because Russia has more drones in its possession now than it ever did before, and that statement will continue to be true week after week for the foreseeable future, perhaps until Ukraine starts finding ways to target Russia's drone production facilities, which seems to be the direction that Kyiv is heading. Switching to the other target, what was the downside risk to Israel here? Was Iran going to further arm its proxies? Was it going to start enriching uranium? Was it going to fire ballistic missiles and long-range drones at Israel, something that Israel has already spent billions to prepare for? To coerce someone, you need to convince them that something bad will happen if they take the action, but that the bad thing will not happen if they do not take the action. If you tell me that you will do something bad to me regardless, then I am not going to factor your threat into my decision-making process, because it literally does not matter. And hence, from a political deterrence perspective, Russia and Iran were among the easiest targets in the entire world. To reset things, both Russia and Iran were theoretically hardened military targets, but were relatively vulnerable politically because deterrence had already failed. Let's compare that to the challenges a country like the United States faces now. Given the distance that Ukraine managed to cover with its strike, perhaps you think that everywhere in the United States is vulnerable. And that may be true, but bear in mind that Ukraine had to assemble the drones inside of Russia. Well, maybe you think that the United States has a better protected border. Or maybe you think that US intelligence would be better at exposing the operation. Or the FBI would be better at tracking down the operatives after they arrived. If only such capacity solved the problem. Even if you are that optimistic, the United States still cannot relax. Let's keep zooming into here. Welcome to El Paso, Texas. With a population of 679,000, it ranks as the 22nd largest city in the United States. The thing is, Ciudad Juarez is just south of it. Population 1.5 million. So even if you think that the US Border Patrol and the FBI have it on lockdown, that would do El Paso little good if you think that sneaking some drones and agents into Mexico would be super easy. And once there, attacking El Paso would be barely an inconvenience, because both of those things are that simple. Let's focus on right here. El Paso International Airport. Because we know that if you want to disrupt the US economy, aiming for anything and everything plane related is a good starting point. And I know that I keep saying this, but here's the thing again. It sits just 4 miles from the border. Now, your average handheld drone used in the Ukrainian war effort has a range of about 6 miles. A potential saboteur, therefore, would not even need to access the US cellular network to commit the attack. All they would need to do is drive up to the border, deploy, and scram. Meanwhile, if civilian infrastructure is not the target that the saboteur has in mind, Fort Bliss is literally right next door. I am not exaggerating here. Actually, the distance question is more favorable. Drive up, launch, and leave. Point is, even if you are optimistic about US border security, there is a real vulnerability here. But that's just the military logistics part. That takes us to the question of US political vulnerability, which is where things get complicated. Confession time. I started scripting this video in the first week of June, in the immediate aftermath of Operation Spiderweb. At the time, the United States was not at war with anyone. Thus, US political vulnerability was relatively low. The central lesson of this video was going to be that drones may become a significant deterrent, as the White House must now factor those potential costs into any offensive actions it takes in the future. Moreover, I was specifically going to point to Iran, which has trouble projecting power far enough to seriously threaten US interests. Meanwhile, its most damaging retaliatory option is to close the Strait of Hormuz, but that comes at the cost of shooting itself in the foot by limiting its own oil exports, and it would undoubtedly set off something fierce in Beijing. Consequently, Trojan horse drones play a role that Iran did not really have access to a few months ago. In any case, the Trump administration blew right past any hypotheticals by striking 3 key Iranian nuclear facilities on June 22nd. As it stands now, it is hard to adjudicate where exactly we are in the threat environment. Because the United States' attack was a one and done, and also because Washington's leverage with Israel also helped end that war, it is unclear whether Tehran would want to restart anything by seeking retribution with some quadcopters. In contrast, Israel is in a worse position. Iran certainly would like to see more damage there after having gotten clobbered for 12 days. And if you worry that Mexico's security is porous, just wait until you find out who is on Israel's borders. But focusing on Iran alone as the problem overlooks perhaps the biggest challenge that the United States faces overall. In fact, our last focus for today is something known as the Attribution Problem. And what I really want to do here is to introduce you to the central lessons from this paper, Deterrence with Imperfect Attribution. For the sake of simplicity, imagine that the United States has a couple of rivals. Let's stick with Iran for one of them. Meanwhile, and goodness knows that Washington has a huge rogues gallery to choose from, let's call the other one Mystery Militant Group X. Both might want to attack the United States, but neither is too keen on suffering the punishment that Washington might dish out in the aftermath. For the United States, achieving deterrence here is easy when you know exactly who is attacking you. Just have a ridiculously powerful military, and neither will dare cross you. However, a major problem arises when attacks are not perfectly attributable. That is, conditional on having been attacked. The United States might be able to find a smoking gun that traces the operation back to one of the parties. But it might also end up clueless in the aftermath, and thus unable to infer to whom it should direct its wrath. You can see how a Trojan horse drone attack might fall into this category. Not everyone is going to be like Ukraine and turn a spider's web into an advertising campaign. There are 3 key findings to know about such environments. First, conditional on being attacked, unless there is a smoking gun, the United States cannot directly infer who conducted the operation. Now, that might sound like it is self-evident, but it is not. If only one actor were in a position to conduct an attack, you would not need a smoking gun to know who did it. You could reason through the situation by making a logical inference, and a very basic one at that. But a problem quickly arises here. Imagine indeed that only one country had an interest in attacking. Say it is Iran. Then, as I just described, the United States would know that any attack must be from Iran. It does not need to see an Iranian flag painted on bits of drone to figure it out, given that Iran is the only willing and able country to conduct the attack. In turn, the United States targets its retaliation against Iran, simple as that. However, Iran would prefer to not attack conditional on retaliation, and it can avoid that retaliation by simply not attacking in the first place. No attack, no retaliation. The logic is the same for why the militant group alone cannot be the only one who would ever plan an attack. Then the United States would know, and it would be goodbye militant group X. And that takes us to the second key point. Both of them will attack some portion of the time. Who ends up being the one to do it depends on who figures out the logistics first, which, importantly, is also something that the United States might not observe. This creates a perverse incentive that leads to more attacks overall. Now the attacking party does not bear the entire cost of an operation, because the other might be wrongly punished. So if the militant group was previously on the fence about conducting an attack, suddenly it is going to be all in. For example, if that group attacks, then the United States might take a wild guess and assume that Iran was responsible. X ends up very happy, while Iran is annoyed that the United States has bombed some of its assets, even though Iran did nothing wrong. Iran, of course, has the same incentive, and so you get that aforementioned increase in attack levels, well beyond what would happen under more transparent circumstances. The final point is where things get really bad for the current situation. Increasing the belligerence of one potential culprit imposes a spillover effect on the other one. The United States just blew up some very expensive Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Tehran is undoubtedly upset, even if it might not be driven to the point of wanting to restart hostilities with the United States. But think about this from the militant group's perspective. Now, if it commits an attack, the default assumption is going to be that Iran was the perpetrator. So now it becomes more inclined to commit an attack. It can get away with it. In turn, even if Iran would prefer to let bygones be bygones right now, that may not matter if Washington does not know that and cannot correctly attribute the attack. Thus, overall, the United States has just put itself in a very vulnerable position, at a time when the technology of covert action has never been more concerning. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to get an excellent 40% off Advantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.